I would now like to introduce today's speaker. Michael Jansen, Chief Research Officer, guides the practice's research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Ashwin Venkatesan, Vice President, leads Everest Group's practice focused on serving enterprise IT leaders. Ashwin is responsible for developing Everest Group's research offerings focused on CIOs, CDOs, CTOs, CISOs, and IT strategy heads across application, cloud and infrastructure, data, and security services. And now I would like to turn the webinar over to Michael. Michael, please go ahead.
Thank you. And hello, everybody. Welcome from Dallas, Texas, or just north of Dallas, Texas. And today's topic is one of the most critical topics that senior leaders in IT are facing across the board, really, the IT talent shortage, and what's actually broadened out to be more of a talent shortage across many of our disciplines. So today we're going to get beyond just the talk about, hey, we have a problem. We're going to talk about what organizations are doing to mitigate it. What are they doing that makes them stand out above everybody else? And so we're going to use the Pinnacle model, which is designed to compare one enterprise performance against another enterprise performance. And we'll get into more details about how that works in reality. But the goal today is to see how your peers are doing compared to others. And, you know, when Ashwin and I were talking about the results, you know, one of the things he was talking about is that it's not necessarily the biggest companies, those with the most amount of money to invest, that are performing the best. So we actually saw some mid-sized companies actually doing quite well. And I think everybody should be paying attention to what those organizations are doing. So one thing about the Pinnacle model is we do compare capabilities versus those outcomes. And again, we'll show that in just a second. So with that, let's get into the detail and some of the data. And so is this a challenge? Absolutely. You know, in terms of talent, we are definitely seeing attrition rates starting to rise. We've been talking about this for a while, but it's starting to become an across the board issue. So talent attrition rates are up 10.5 points just in the last quarter over a quarter. When we start to bring that into context with the next slide, what you're going to see in terms of the, you know, we're looking for a kind of a desired outcome here is really having that predictability in the pipeline, really proving the workforce metrics. The idea is to create those resilience of the organization, but do it so in such a way that it doesn't bust our budgets completely. I think most of you have had to bust your budgets to a certain extent, but we want to do it so that it's not catastrophic to the organization. So with that, what's the reality that you're seeing, Ashwin?
Yeah, Michael. So the utopian view is there, as you said, right? Getting the best quality talent at speed and in very predictably, right? And it's not a case where enterprises are not realizing this. Every enterprise realizes it. There are investments that are being made. There have been strategies that are being formulated. What we're observing, though, is that not every enterprise is successful right now, and many of them are not getting the desired outcomes in terms of the metrics. So you talked about the cross-section not just being some of the biggest banks or the tech vendors, even some of the mid-size enterprises getting it right. So it's not about who you are, but what you are doing, which is going to enable the outcomes. And that's exactly what we want to unpack more as part of this discussion.
Okay, great. And so let's start with some input from the audience here. Let's get an understanding of how you think your organization's current strategic IT workforce development posture is today. So we're going to open up a quick poll here and ask you to select where you think you stack. Where do you think you are on this stack of different elements here? So are you highly reactive, or are you very proactive, or somewhere in between? So we'll go ahead and ask you to put your answers in there. We'll leave it open for about 6-7 seconds here. And okay, I think we're getting some honesty here. You know, the answers. All right, I'll leave it open for 3, 2, 1. All right. All right, so this is, when you look at these results here, nobody feels like they've got this figured out completely. Nobody's believing they've got it future-proof, which is indicative of what I think we're hearing from everybody out there. And a full fifth of the audience here is highly reactive. And I think that's probably—
I think the audience has given us a sneak peek of our own data, Michael.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and when you start to see this, you start to say, maybe they're just putting out, hey, if I post more help wanted signs out on the street or put them up on some job posting boards, that's not going to maybe cut it anymore.
Exactly.
So what else are you thinking? What else are you seeing in those results there, Ashwin?
I think what we're going to also see is even the ones that are talking about more. First of all, this doesn't come as a surprise, right? So it's a journey. Everyone is maturing. So even the proactive ones, and to give a sneak peek of what's happening, even the ones who say they're proactive are the ones who actually believe they have a lot to do, right? And then that's something that we're going to bring up during the discussion as well.
Okay, so let's put it in context of an overall framework here. And so the traditional view of the HR view of talent acquisition has been really one of recruitment. So how do I go out and recruit people? And it's really focused really on that number 2 area over on the right-hand side. So how do I acquire, retain, and activate talent? Very traditional HR view. We think it's important to expand that view to include a workforce strategy, which is very much more expansive in terms of what you're considering. So you should be looking at a overall demand supply view. So like I said, you can't just rely on posting more things. If the talent isn't there, it's not there. And so you need to understand, where in the world can you find this, locations, what are the sourcing models, how do people want to work? And some of that skills taxonomy has gotten very, very complex over time. It's not just a few IT roles, it's thousands of different types of IT roles that you're looking for, or they're out there in the universe, and you got to figure out which ones are the ones you need right now. It also goes beyond that into the workforce, looking at the work itself. So not just saying, hey, if I get people on board, I have a good workforce strategy, but I also need to figure out how am I going to redesign the work so that that it feels right for those employees that come on board. It's making them more productive. It's continuous improvement. There's technology layers and analytics there to support it. And then, of course, it all needs to come together with an orchestrated strategy. So that's our view of the macro of what you should be considering it here. And then if we drive into this Pinnacle model specifically, what we're going to be doing here, as I said, comparing the capabilities versus outcomes on the Pinnacle model on the next slide. Can we go to the next? There we go. All right, so on this next slide here, what we have is a dot plot. And what we're doing on here is we're plotting out every single person that participated in the study. And you'll see that the vast majority go from the lower left to the upper right. And again, we're looking for that, again, cause and effect. So what did you do and what did you get on the outcome? And so what we're going to do in this analysis is compare those Pinnacle companies in the upper right, those that have done well on both capability and outcomes, and compare those to the rest of the database. So Ashwin, talk about those different capabilities, because that's the things that change from one Pinnacle model to another Pinnacle models. Those capabilities, they change.
Yeah.
What do we focus on here?
Yeah, so if you look at the x-axis, right, so there are multiple dimensions we are considering. The overall approach, the internal organizational structure to enable workforce development, right? Then a lot of the investments theme, which is around which locations, what kind of sourcing models, what kind of channels are being used to enable some of this, what are some of the investments being made from an acquisition and retention standpoint, technologies that are being used, the infrastructure being used to run some of this planning some of these initiatives and forecasting and so on and so forth. So variety of capability themes being brought together, which has been compared with outcomes, which is not just about cost, but also around some of the key metrics around talent acquisition, timelines, quality, and consequently even the impact that's been created on the business, right? So revenue per IT employees or employee engagement levels and so on and so forth. So a lot of RFI data, surveys, roundtables, all of these have been conducted to put this data together.
Yeah, so it's both a quantitative and a qualitative conversation. The other thing I'd note on this here in the Pinnacle model methodology is you won't see any dots in the upper left. Okay, so if you only have basic capability, do not expect superior outcomes. Okay, and the same thing goes in the bottom right here. There's a couple dots down there, but for the most part, you won't find companies that have well-developed capabilities and not getting the outcomes they're looking for. Usually we see none. There's 2 here in this case, but what you're going to see is that as you do more, you should expect more outcomes, and that's what we're going to unpack it throughout the rest of this webinar, is talk about those capabilities that created those outcomes. Okay, so let's go on to the next section, Ashwin, and let's talk about those implications for the enterprise. And let's drive down in terms of what's your overall so what.
Sure, Michael. So the first question that comes to mind is who actually owns this within the organization, right? Who needs to be held responsible for developing the workforce? Is there one superhero, which has to be the IT or the HR, or is it more? So the fundamental realization that's turning out is that we need a set of Avengers to really drive this, right? Yes, this is about IT workforce, IT is involved. Yes, HR is involved in a lot of recruitment activities, but there are a lot of other functions, right? You think of procurement, which is managing the third-party relations, which is also bringing talent into the equation. Businesses giving their inputs around what IT needs to do, what it needs to hire, and then so on and so forth. Even some of the adjacent functions like finance, legal, everyone has a role to play, right? So then the question becomes, what are Pinnacle Enterprises doing different? Well, first and foremost, they have a Nick Fury with them, which is basically the top right team, which is a dedicated workforce team, which is overseeing all of this. Now, what we observed is even enterprises that lie outside of whom we call Pinnacle also have such teams which are being developed, right? The key difference that's coming in is points 2 and 3. The central orchestration seems to be much more effective in Pinnacle Enterprises. So there are a clear set of responsibilities around what HR seems to be doing, needs to do rather, what IT needs to do, what is the role of the COO office, and so on and so forth. So there's clear accountability of metrics, roles, jobs, and this is very well knit and orchestrated, right? So that's one fundamental difference. The second theme, what we see in Pinnacle Enterprises is this is not just about looking at your own internal retained workforce. There's a holistic view that's being taken around what's happening from an overall talent standpoint, whether it's your internal teams or it is about the talent that's being brought in through your outsourcers, your staffing providers, and so on and so forth. So fundamentally, from a design perspective, there seems to be much more tighter orchestration collaboration within Pinnacle Enterprises. Now that's from a design angle.
Yeah, so Ashwin, let me just jump in here first. So we've actually done Pinnacle studies on just the contingent workforce. And I remember going through those results with various different groups in that context. And I remember that there was a very distinct, Pinnacle Enterprises did have this collaborative model. The non-Pinnacles, in many cases, the HR organization and the sourcing organization, for example, may not even be talking about this whole topic or having that discussion at all. And there was like, hey, those people that are on the contingent workforce, you know, I don't own them. They're somebody else. They wear a red badge and everybody else wears a blue badge. And I think that's, you know, that's playing into the discussion you're having right here as well, is it's got to be, those aren't the other people. Those are the people that you're going to need in the future in many cases.
Yep, absolutely, Michael. And the collaboration point, it's not simple bringing such huge functions together at the end of the day, right? So there needs to be effort that needs to be put in. There need to be design elements. There needs to be change management. So clearly enterprises who have understood and invested in this theme over multiple years are the ones who seem to be reaping better outcomes. So yeah.
Yeah, and in those organizations that were not integrated or were not talking to each other, there was kind of that feeling that since those are the people that have the red badges and they have different rules, we're not going to include them. And that's where I kind of thought, wow, you're missing a real opportunity there. So, all right, let's move on.
Yeah. So that's one aspect of the design aspect, but there are other headline items that we've also picked in terms of what best-in-class companies are doing better or differently, right? So there are 7 themes that we have identified over here. Theme 1 is about looking into the future, right? So it's not about here and now. Pinnacle Enterprises have a 2 to 3 year horizon, but at the same time, this is coupled with a lot of regular interventions and strategic corrections that are done to ensure that the course has been maintained rightly, right? So that's one theme. Points 2 and 3 are about Pinnacle Enterprises taking more of the initiatives and kind of trying to hold more keys to the keys to the kingdom and taking things into their own hands, right? And one of the themes that we'll discuss is that while there is move towards internal build, it's not just depending upon external hiring, but reskilling existing teams that they have and driving a lot more internal mobility to fulfill requirements, right? So that's the key theme that's been playing out. We'll go into locations. So obviously there's a lot of flux around what the location strategy needs to be in the short term. We'll talk about it. But one clear theme that's coming out from a location angle is forward-looking enterprises are taking a long-term view, right? So it's not just about, hey, where talent is available tomorrow, but where will talent be available in the next 10 years, 15 years, thinking about climate change, thinking about a lot of diversity and inclusion themes, right? So that's becoming important. 5 and 6 are more of the intangibles, or what I'd call as softer themes around talent and engagement. But the point is that the fundamental difference between best in class and other enterprises seems to be providing lip service versus really walking the path that's been charted out, right? So whether it's about employee benefit programs or setting diversity and inclusion targets, it's not just about external posturing or doing it when it only matters. It's seen as a continuous theme and a continuous charter and driven down across the IT organization. And then finally, given that we recognize that the cost baseline is going to increase significantly, we see companies which are again forward-looking, taking a huge focus and putting a lot of efforts into the theme of productivity. So it's going to be a game of getting more done with less at this point in time. So enterprises are starting to think about which are the right metrics to track, what kind of processes to put in to really ensure that each and every employee is bringing the best value to the table for the salaries that are being paid, right? It's as simple as that. So those are some of the high-level observations that you had. Michael, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, no, I just say, and measuring is always good, is important for not only for, hey, I want to understand productivity, but I also want to start, how do we want to change our goals? If we're going to make something, we want to move the needle, we've got to be able to track it. So, all right, well, let's move on. I think the next slide here, Ashwin, you took your nephew to the zoo last week, and you're going to come back with your findings and how it relates to the talent crisis.
Sure, Michael. So when we look at enterprises and the reaction to this current IT talent scramble, so we think of 4 personas, right? So what you see on the x-axis is acknowledgement of the issue. What we see on the y-axis is willingness to act on that issue. So the first persona is ostriches. There are enterprises who are saying or thinking that, hey, this is a passing cloud at this point in time. We do not want to do anything, right? Attrition, it'll be back to normal, and then so on and so forth. These are potentially the most vulnerable set of enterprises that we see at this point in time. There's a second angle, right? It's kind of the enterprises who realize that there is something needs to be done, but there's no method to the madness, right? So every possible lever has been thought of. It's being pulled in a very ad hoc manner at this point in time. So there's no strategic intent being put around all of this, right? So that's the second persona. The third ones, which we call as sheep, are the ones which are more aware than the folks who are on the left side. There is a realization that things need to be done, but the point is they're kind of going with the flow of the river rather than putting in a strategic thinking to what needs to be done, right? So if more salaries are offered, hey, let's go and give it. If providers need more price increases, let's do that, right? If employees want to work from a particular location, let's do it. The problem here is these enterprises are setting up for a baseline and an expectation, which is not going to be sustainable in the long term. So we believe that the real deal in this entire landscape are going to be the wolves who have a method to this madness. So they are willing to act and try to improve the situation. But then there is strategic clarity around what needs to be done. There is understanding of what's happening in the market. Peer exercises are well understood. And then internally, there is clarity around, hey, this is the particular direction that we need to take. These are the levers that we need to pull. And the key thing here is that everything is revisited in a cyclic fashion, right? So eventually we believe enterprises need to be as smart as wolves, right? And that's where our inspiration from the animal kingdom comes.
Right.
Now, if we apply this to the context of Pinnacle Enterprises on the next slide, right? We believe, and what we observed is that Pinnacle Enterprises are wolves, right? So to quote Eisenhower, plans are nothing, but planning is everything. Counterintuitively, what we have seen is the best-in-class enterprises are the ones who believe they need to fundamentally keep investing and keep improving the future readiness of their workforce. So the kind of investments that they're making across different themes, right? Whether it's the kind of skills and roles that they're looking at, whether they're looking at their sourcing options, their location options, whatever it might be. There's a clear understanding that this is a journey, and enterprises who believe that they've done, who kind of think of this as one and done kind of motions, are the ones who are eventually seeing that outcomes start coming in a short-term perspective, but in the long term, they're not able to adapt to what's happening in the market. So our advocacy here is think of this as a journey, because we are seeing the wolves really take this as a long-term challenge versus just staying here and now in present.
All right, fantastic. So let's open up another quick poll here. And what we want to do is get us some ideas from you in terms of what you think the biggest deterrent to building an effective IT workforce. And so we're going to open it up here. There's about 6 different options for you to choose. So we ask you to choose one. And I think these are all things that people don't want to admit to. But pick the one that's the biggest challenge for your organization. Okay, we'll leave it open for another 5, 4, 3. It's actually kind of a horse race here. 3, 2, 1. Okay, all right. I'm looking at these results here, and it really is. I mean, they're struggling with most of all of the above. So that's the clear winner here in terms of that.
Yeah.
But when you look at the rest of the answers, not so much on the governance, but the employee development, the sourcing, the centralized visibility, lack of clear vision, they're all ranked in there. And there's not.
Yeah, that's interesting, Michael, because essentially, if what we're saying is we talked about the 4 elements of workforce strategy. There was this workforce planning part and then the people execution part. So either we see the audience say that they're struggling with both and they need to do more, but a large part agree that it's the planning part of things, right, which requires a fundamental revisit and a lot of thinking needs to be put in there, versus the engagement and retention elements where there's no silver bullet, but there are a lot of initiatives that have been tried by one another.
All right, so let's start walking through those capabilities and outcomes from the Pinnacle model. Enough talk about what the goals are here. Let's get into the actual detail.
Sure. So just a recap, right? So we showed the Pinnacle model where there was this x-axis around capabilities. So this is just a recap of the elements that we have. So we looked at what the overall approach is. We looked at what kind of investments are being made, both from a planning as well as a sourcing and location standpoint. People investments, acquisition, engagement, retention. In some ways, this becomes the execution angle on that particular strategy. Then workforce optimization, the kind of back-end investments that are being made to drive planning, drive forecasting, as well as driving productivity. So that's the technology and tools angle. And then the element around orchestrating and bringing together all of this. And what we're getting into the next slides is delving deeper into each of these themes and what we have unearthed. So the first one. So being Everest Group, we always like to use the name Everest. I have used this analogy in the past as well. So if you think of workforce development as potentially scaling Mount Everest, the first place that you want to get to is the Everest base camp, right? And in that sense, the foundational thing that all enterprises need to do is have a robust understanding of what skills and roles that they require in the first place, right? So tracking becomes important. Developing a robust taxonomy becomes important. Defining the roles in the right way becomes important, right? So we start thinking about full stack developers. We're talking about DevSecOps engineers. Now, these are cross-functional capabilities. A number of skills are required. There are soft skills, right, from team collaboration, bonding, leadership. All of these need to be brought into the picture. So we're seeing Pinnacle Enterprises have a very good view of what the baseline really looks like. So there's a lot of rigor that's being put into defining centrally the exact taxonomy of skills and roles that are required across the organization. They are being updated constantly. And there's a clear definition that do not go just into the technical specificities, but also the personas of the roles, right? The softer skills that are also required to enable those employees to do the job and bring value to the team, right? So this kind of becomes the foundational step.
So Ashwin, when you and I have done this conversation before on just the skills, not worrying about the shortages or the optimization, we've been talking about the evolution of the IT skills. And I think that's where this comes hand in glove in terms of bringing those two projects together.
Exactly, Michael. And that's where a lot of work that we do and enterprises do around developing detailed skill passports, skilling journeys, reskilling roadmaps, and so on and so forth. All of that come into the picture over here. That's correct.
Yeah, so we have a supply demand issue, but we also have a change, an evolving set of expectations on the behalf of enterprises with IT digital skills keep continuing to evolve. So hey, I need more business context. I need more just softer skills in the mix.
That's correct.
Yeah.
On the vision and strategy part, the second element is also about how do you bring together the business and IT imperatives, right? So you start thinking about being a bank, you want to go into, you want to serve your customers as a lifestyle, right? That essentially means that you're becoming a data company, right? So you're not going to require a lot of data engineers. In many cases, enterprises may be coming for M&As, divestitures, and so on and so forth. So there's so much happening in the business at this point in time, which is going to impact your fundamental technology estate and how it's going to look like. So anchoring all the business imperatives as part of workforce development strategies is key. And at the same time, obviously, there needs to be a clear roadmap around how the IT organization itself is going to evolve, right? Which stacks do you want to go into? Which cloud providers you want to concentrate yourself on, and then so on and so forth. And then obviously, what's your focus around potential healthy attrition rates and all of that. What we've seen is most Pinnacle enterprises consider all of the elements that we're talking about on this slide with equal weightage as they build their workforce strategies, right? And what we see the other enterprises not do is potentially, or actually end up doing is missing on some of these key elements, which ends up leaving gaping holes in the overall strategy. And as it is executed, a lot of the outcomes then do not start to appear as intended, right? So this kind of becomes the second key angle of the overall approach or vision, wherein Pinnacle enterprises seem to be doing something very different and can be learned from.
Okay, so let's look at one of the structural issues that we're dealing with here. And if you look at the macroeconomic or macro demographic information, one of the things that we're doing for an upcoming session is really talk about the need to bring in the different forms of workers in different locations here. And I think I jumped ahead on you Ashwin here, but we'll skip the next slide here and we'll come back to that one. But really that need to drive into different locations and drive different types of workers and different classes of workers and different things here. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so fundamentally what we're seeing is this is the point around long-term location strategy that I made, right? So there is one school of thought or one perspective that's been brought in by enterprises, which is, hey, let's solve for the now. I want to understand which is the next location that I can look at over the next 2 to 3 months to really fulfill the short-term talent requirements that I have, right? So what's the talent availability over there? Who is the competition of peers from whom we can hire, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't seem to be the way how mature enterprises or Pinnacle enterprises are operating, right? In parallel, they're taking a long-term view wherein talent is going to be impacted by a multitude of forces, right? So availability is going to be a function of what kind of locations are going to be sustainable from a climate change perspective. There's a lot of focus, and understandably so, on diversity and inclusion. So are there locations which are already seeming to be more friendly in terms of making technology talent available, which adhere to some of the diversity issues that we need to keep in mind? And all of this cannot be made on gut sense, right? So this has to be data-driven, this has to be fact-based. And what we have provided here is a snapshot of how we have been analyzing some of these key dimensions to help enterprises think through long-term strategies, right? So that's the essence of this particular slide.
Yeah, so you're essentially broadening the pool.
Exactly, right? And if we go back to the previous slide, just to tie this off, right? So there are fundamental points of discussion from a location standpoint and understand these two, right? So right now, the questions that we see enterprises have is, we are allowing work from home for a lot of our employees. What's the future going to look like, right, at this point in time? So we're seeing enterprises take a wait and watch approach. What we eventually will believe that there will be a consolidation of workforces across key hubs. There'll be a hub and spoke model that will come in. There's going to be a hybrid model of remote working and office working that's going to be here, right? Enterprises are looking to add a few locations to their portfolio to expand availability in the short term, but they're not going all out expansive and adding 15, 20 different locations, right? So we're seeing multiple examples where enterprises have, say, 20 tech centers. They're looking to take this to 25 to drive short to midterm sustainability. But the elements on the bottom are the ones where a lot of thought is being put into some of the advanced enterprises, and that ties to the example that we just showed. So there's climate change, there's demographics to be kept in mind, and obviously there's a lot of social elements that are going to be brought into the table, right? So that's from a location and a workforce investment standpoint. Now, as we move along, we get into the people investments part of it, right? So we get a lot of questions around, hey, there are a lot of different things that we are trying out at this point in time. So we as an enterprise realize that external hiring alone won't cut it. Our outsourcing providers alone are not going to be the ones who are going to provide us talent. So a lot of the elements that we see on the left are already being tried out by different enterprises, right? So if we ask whether you're tried, are you exploring one of these 7 elements that, or each of these 7 elements that we're talking about on this particular slide, the answer invariably would be an yes. The key difference seems to be how these are being integrated into the broader workforce strategy, right? So let me take an example from an internal mobility perspective. So when this entire IT scramble started panning out, we saw a lot of enterprises starting to look inward, right? Hey, let's look at certain sections of our IT workforce who are potentially working on some non-critical projects. Let us just quickly reskill them and potentially put them in areas which are more critical to the business, right? So that's looking at internal mobility from a short-term perspective. What Pinnacle Enterprises we observe are doing is thinking of internal mobility as a long-term strategic lever, right? So if you see the example on the left, on the right, we are seeing enterprises where targets have been set that more than 70% of all niche skills around cloud, around AI, are going to be fundamentally fulfilled just by taking internal talent and reskilling and upskilling them. Now, this is going to require programs, expensive programs to really train people. That's one. You need to think of how career paths are going to be set up. You need to think of how incentives and salary structures are going to be thought of. And then there is the entire element of change management, right? Managers need to let go of certain people whom they like to move to different teams to do what they do from an internal mobility perspective. A second quick example, right? Everyone goes to engineering colleges at this point in time. But some of the best-in-class companies, they are actually tying up with and undertaking more advanced programs. They're potentially not even looking at college graduates. They're also thinking of how we can tap into 12 grade folks who are coming out and reskill them and potentially have them as part of the workforce. So there are innovative channels, but the structure, the intent, and the effort that's being put in and the orchestration to bring all of this together holds the key for more superior outcomes.
Yeah, it's not a one silver bullet here that's going to work. I mean, you said going after, lesser degrees, that kind of accelerates tapping to next year's pool, but it doesn't solve the big picture question.
That's correct. Moving on. So from a people investment perspective, right? So we talk a lot about technology, skills, and making people project ready to really work on the different initiatives that we give to them. Now we are almost entering, and we have entered a zone where we are starting to see that compensation and benefits are almost becoming the common denominator right now, right? So there are many enterprises who have already benchmarked, they understand that they need to put in more money out of their pockets to really attract talent, right? So that alone is not going to be the differentiation anymore. The key is going to be around how you truly engage your IT workforce, give them a purpose to work for your brand, make them feel connected as part of the entire organizational ecosystem, right? Which also translates into your broader employee value proposition. That is exactly where the end game lies as we go forward and we think of talent development. So let me take an example, right? So if you look at the second bottom element that we have in this entire hierarchy of IT employee needs, we're talking about aspirations, right? What we're seeing is in many organizations, if you think of software developers, they've been thought of as a homogeneous cohort in some ways, right? Similar journeys to growth, similar kind of development structures, similar kind of salary structures, and so on and so forth. But we are entering a workforce where there are millennials. They really want to do things that they like to do, and they're not bothered about accelerated growth potentially in every single case, right? They want to expand their horizons, try different things. So it's about creating personalized career paths, understanding the intentions of that individual software developer rather than the software development cohort, right? So this requires a different level of thinking. This requires a different design to develop talent and in putting development structures in place. And then there are higher order elements that we have also represented over here. So one of the other key themes that has played out during the pandemic is there's a lot of remote workforce. The question that we are getting asked is, we have put all potential tools and collaboration technologies in place, but still we feel a lot of our IT employees are feeling disconnected, right? So the theme is around bringing in that human touch, right? So when a new employee comes into the organization or the team, they want to build familiarity as soon as possible. So are you giving them mentors? Are you giving them buddies? Are you ensuring that co-located teams are being pushed to collaborate, exchange ideas while driving autonomy and holding themselves accountable to certain outcomes? These themes are the ones that are going to fundamentally shape the design of workforce in the future, and enterprises who are able to think through this and define strategies around this are the ones who are going to be successful. And as we do that, right, we see that there are a lot of technologies that are available out there in the market at this point in time to really help enterprises achieve some of this, right? So the entire tools landscape to help with workforce planning is quite expansive if you really think about it, right? So on the one side, we have solutions that are popping up to help with forecasting, planning, skill mapping, and so on and so forth, right? There are platforms that are being used to develop internal mobility, right? There are obviously learning solutions and so on and so forth. And there are a number of use cases which best-in-class enterprises are really able to identify and put in place by leveraging these technologies. What we're seeing is it's a combination. So there are off-the-shelf tools that are available in the market, but in many cases, there are bespoke kind of applications that are built on top. And both of these elements are being brought together by enterprises to really drive value within the organization. We have done a lot of research around this, and it seems to be a very interesting space. There needs to be a very careful evaluation of tools that needs to be done. But definitely, it's a trend that's going to be a mainstay as part of broader workforce planning as we go along.
Yeah, Ash, when I see this list of tools and technologies to install, it reminds me of your visit to the zoo about the chicken and the egg, right? So, you know, you've got to make that investment so that you can prosper down the road. I think that's going to be where do you find these people to make that investment?
Yeah, that's one. And Michael, to that, a couple of things, right? So one, careful evaluation of the tools over here. And the second is not looking at these in isolation. So in many cases, as an example, we've seen that people are just using people analytics tools, but the kind of integration that it has with internal systems, right? With the career pathing tools or with the application tracking tools. So that synergy and straight through value processing is simply not there. So while the perception is that we are putting dollars into the equation, potentially there's this jigsaw that is missing that needs to be put together to find value by bringing all of this together in one frame. Moving along, right? So we talked a lot about capabilities, and we have a couple of slides to wrap this up where we want to talk about outcomes at the end of the day. So if we think of workforce development, right? So there are a lot of key metrics that can be tracked, which we'll talk about and spend some time in the next slide. But fundamentally, we talked about putting method to the madness. We talked about, hey, it's not just about making plans, it's about planning, which is an ongoing journey. You're going to need to course correct and so on and so forth. So given the elements that we have seen where Pinnacle Enterprises are doing differently from a capability and investment standpoint, what we are observing is their ability to see superior outcomes is pretty consistent, right? So if you take the left side of the equation in the workforce framework that we showed, right, which was around workforce planning and budgeting, there are multiple different themes where Pinnacle Enterprise seem to be far more successful at this point in time, be it in terms of staying ahead of the game and then being able to preempt what kind of demand that they'll require, exactly for which nature of skills and so on and so forth. They seem to be much more accurate in their predictions and in forecasting, right? So that's number one. In terms of having a view in, as an organization, what are the skills that you want to build in-house? What are the ones you want your third parties to build for you? What do you want to hire and so on and so forth? What we're seeing is when we see normal enterprises, there seems to be some guesswork that's going on. And then as we go into the execution of the workforce strategy, there are a lot of adjustments that are need to be made. And there's a sudden realization, hey, this is a set of skills that we can't build anymore. So suddenly there's a requirement for reaching out to external parties, ramping up hiring at a very short notice. So it's simply not a smooth ride for normal enterprises. The ride seems to be much more better for Pinnacle Enterprises, as we put it, right? So that's number two. And then having more credibility around the time that's required to onboard. So invariably, we see Pinnacle Enterprises feel a lot of less pressure from business in terms of, hey, we are not getting the right IT skills to serve our particular business objectives at this point in time. And this is essentially exacerbated for emerging skills. When you think of cloud, when you think of AI, these are skills where we see at least a time to hire of anywhere between 4 to 6 months if you really go out in the market and you want to hire. Where Pinnacle Enterprises are able to do better is they're able to preempt some of this because they're planning right, they're getting their skills taxonomy right, they're making the right investments in terms of developing different channels. So they're able to crush the time to hire in some ways. And when all of this is put in place, Michael talked about the key point around costs. We see that Pinnacle Enterprises are not essentially spending more to do all of this, right? Given that there is planning, given that there is no afterthought, they're able to do this within budgets and not in a position where they're going back next year, asking their CIOs and COOs to potentially raise workforce costs by 15 to 20% without a proper design in place or a proper business case in place, right? So net of it, there seems to be a clear causality between maturing capabilities with the right strategy, with the right design, and seeing superior outcomes.
Okay, let's move on to the final aspect of it, which is compare the outcomes. And so in this case, we haven't broken between cost, operational, and business impact metrics here that we examined here. And you'll see in the green outline is those are the results of the Pinnacles and the changes they've seen in the last 12 months versus the blue. And what you identified, Ashwin, really those ones that are starred, so there's 6 of them that are starred, those are the ones that made the biggest difference from an analytical standpoint. Let's talk about those in terms of outcomes and any other factors that made a difference here.
Sure. And most interestingly, Michael, 5 out of these 6 stars lie in the operating metrics part of it, right? Which is essentially how fast you're able to hire talent from the market, how effectively you're able to hold on to your existing talent so the turnover is less. A lot of the new employees who are joining in are not taking that 1 year of experience and running away and jumping ships, right? People whom we are rolling out offers to, we are right now in a market where potentially IT work talent is walking around with 4 or 5 offers in their hands, right, and holding enterprises and service providers to ransom. So the offer to join ratio, right, and that predictability that someone whom you have identified will join you, and consequently all of this leading to themes like bench strength, where you have the necessary bandwidth to plug people into new projects. Now, if you really think about it, in the current environment, it's not just about cost, right? Everyone is realizing that the cost baseline is going to go up by a bit, but this faster time to access, ability to hold on to the people that you have, and ensuring that the people whom you want the organization to join are actually joining. That is essentially what is leading to or resulting in the kind of IT performance or the IT delivery that needs to happen. So it's very apparent that what we have identified as some of the hacks, some of the strategies, some of the thinking that Pinnacle Enterprises are taking are impacting the most relevant metrics that are becoming important in the current landscape of the talent scramble that we have. While doing all of this, obviously there is a business value aspect to this as well, given that there's more focus on productivity, given that you have people who are familiar with your environment, understand your business context, and are working with your organization. A metric like revenue per IT employee is also seeing tremendous increase or improvement when you compare Pinnacle and non-Pinnacle enterprises.
Okay, so we've gone kind of did the fast version of the study results. The full results are 30 or 40 pages in addition to these, which you just saw here. If you're interested, if you're an enterprise and you're interested in participating in the study, it's not too late. We can add you to the dot plot as we showed in the first couple slides here, and we can tell you how you stand up against your peers. It won't change the overall net results of our study, but happy to add you and let you compare how you did. We're going to open up a quick poll, and if you're interested in doing that and you're an enterprise, just say yes, and we'll get your email captured in the tool, and we'll send you the link, and then Ashwin and his team will be able to analyze your results, and we'll get back with you. So I'll leave that open for another 3 seconds. Certainly no obligation on your part, just to see how you stand up against others. Okay, let's go ahead and close that, and let's move on to our final. What are the key implications here? If you're to wrap up, Ashwin, what do you see?
Sure. So as a summary, right? Point number one, all of this is a journey, right? You want to be a wolf. You want to be adaptable. You want to you want to be in a situation where you're able to course correct as you go along. And the fundamental realization is things are not going to stay the same, right? So strategic IT workforce planning is all about thinking about it as an ongoing journey or scaling Everest, as I put it earlier. So that's number one. Once you have that recognition, the fact is that there needs to be some central body or function that governs, and there needs to be dedicated leadership buy-in, right? So the aspect around having a central view, having a team that orchestrates, brings in the capabilities of all relevant functions who have a say in workforce development is going to be important. So that's the Avengers theory. We talked about the foundational requirement, right? And this kind of ties to the question that Mahesh has asked, and I'll come, the question that Tim has asked, and we'll come to it. But having centralized visibility of what your inventory looks like, right? And then building on what kind of forecast, what kind of requirements that you have is going to be key, right? This can't be solved for at an individual IT function level. This can't be solved for when you have different definitions of skills and roles that are waging across your organization. And once that is done, it's important not to just take an IT lens, but start with the business, what it wants, and then get into the IT requirements and consequently the workforce requirements. We definitely see internal mobility to be the game changer. We believe that in a long enough time horizon, enterprises simply cannot depend on the external market, whether it is your outsourcing providers or even your your lateral hiring from the market, right? It's going to be too unpredictable. It's about taking matters into your own hands. And the fundamental focus, in our opinion, in the mid to long term are going to be strategies around internal mobility, how people internally can be trained. Because there's a lot of there is a lot of realization that there are multiple functions within the organization where people simply are outgrowing the requirements, right? So on the one hand, there is the supply that's sitting within the organization, and then there's this demand. It's only about how you build a training program and an upskilling program to make the both meet. And then finally, it's about humanizing everything, right? Tech workers are not simply looking for tech projects. They want to be connected with the organization. So how you set aspirations, right? How do you inculcate leadership skills? How do you make them feel a part of the broader business objective or the aspirations that's been set up by the CEO or the organization? All of that is going to be critical in ensuring that you're developing quality talent and then holding on to it.
All right, fantastic. And so, just as I'm thinking about the summary here, the good news is this is many. It's not just an IT challenge. Okay, this is something that's happening across the organization, and so you're going to see efforts like this not just in IT but everywhere in the organization to kind of how do we up our game. The bad news is this is not going away. This challenge of the demographic trends of diminishing people coming into the workforce is real. It's actually going to get worse, and so as demand for IT goes up, this has become an exponential type challenge, not just one that's incremental in nature. So you can go with Ashwin to the zoo. You can be the headless chicken. You could be the ostrich there. But at some point, that's not only going to be a bad thing, it's going to become mission critical. So, all right, let's do this. We're going to open it up for questions and answers here. And before we do that, so go ahead and type your questions into the chat. And Ashwin and I will try to address those. We've got many ready right now, and so we'll try to get to those, but we can always add one or two more. And if we can't get to them all, we'll come back to you later individually. But before we do that, let me go ahead and ask the question here of Ashwin here in terms of what are you doing for your clients?
Sure, Michael. So we have a dedicated program around IT talent, and then some of the research that we have presented on this in this discussion is important from there. So we have an offering where we help enterprises set up the right IT talent organization, right? So this is easier said than done. So we bring in a lot of data, we bring in a lot of insights. We end up interacting with a lot of organizations. So all of that wisdom and insights are going to be pulled in. There are two ways in which we engage. We have an annual membership program, which provides you a steady access of published material, a lot of benchmarks, be it around talent, locations, compensations, productivity. And we work as a concierge in some ways, right? So we end up being sparring partners for IT talent leaders. So there are a lot of interactions that are built in for a lot of point-in-time requirements as well as strategic validation, right? So it's quite an intimate model. And in cases where our clients have a specific initiative underway, right? It could be around optimization, it could be around setting up newer strategies around workforce development and so on and so forth. We also engage in a much more intimate fashion where we do multi-week projects and engagements to really bring in the insights to help with strategic decision making.
Yeah, and I think right now having data, and given that the world is changing so fast in this space, having the right data available to you is a critical thing. All right, let's go back to some of those questions here. Ashwin, how are you predicting and managing demand and supply profiles?
Yeah, so Tim, that's a good question, right? As I said, so there are multiple steps to this. The first one is what's the baseline for your demand and supply, which essentially goes back to the skills taxonomy part, right? So we have built skills taxonomies which cover around 800 to 1,000 skills in certain cases for enterprises across different IT functions, sub-functions, competencies, and so on and so forth, right? So that becomes a first step, and that needs to be standardized across the organization. Then you start identifying those skills which are going to be emerging versus obsolete. So in our view, we actually have identified a set of 60 to 70 skills, which out of those 800 to 1,000, which in our view is going to account for 3/4 or even more of the demand in the coming next to 1 to 2 years, right? So things can be brought down and concentrated in some ways to try and understand which are the critical list of skills where real programs need to be put in place. Now, once you do that, then you try and juxtapose this with your internal IT requirements, right? What kind of projects and initiatives are being undertaken by the CIO? What is being signed up for? At the same time, are there new business initiatives that are expected to come in? You put all of that together, you start getting a timeline view of, hey, this is the volume of skills that we're going to require over the next 3 months versus 12 months versus 2 years in some ways, right? And then you start doing your workforce analytics to try and understand what's available within the organization. You do skill mapping to try and understand what can be fulfilled with the existing workforce. That's going to give you the gaps that are existing within your portfolio. And that's where you start building the plan around X% being fulfilled through our internal training programs and development programs, Y% through some of the external hiring that we're going to do. And these are the set of commoditized skills that we actually do not want to own as part of the organization. We take that and we give this to a third-party service provider who can run it in a managed services construct and provide us the outputs that we want, right? So there are multiple steps. It's very difficult to articulate in a 2-minute answer, but we'll be more than happy to take you through some of those in more detail.
Yeah, let me simplify it. It's like going to the lake and going fishing. You want to know if there's actual fish in the lake or how you should fish for that lake. It becomes very much of an art form. And if you don't know that there's fish in there, then maybe you got to go somewhere else. Okay, let's try one. Actually, we're out of time here. We'll have to save these questions. And Ashwin, I'm going to ask you to follow up with these folks that have asked offline. And so one more thing we wanted to share with you on the okay, so Ashwin's been all about the peer comparison on a Pinnacle study for the workforce optimization, workforce strategy. We have another Pinnacle study that we just launched. So just getting started with that around the IT sourcing program. So this is more being sponsored by the procurement organization, but IT organizations are participating as well. So another Pinnacle study that allows you to compare yourselves to others in your industry and on this challenge on IT sourcing program. So a little bit different angle, but should be pretty good for you to participate. And if you're interested in it, I think we'll have a link in the make sure I have a link in the follow-up to this, and I think we'll even get it in chat here in a second here. So please feel free to participate in there. And with that, I think if you can, then we have one more slide here. If you're interested in more information on our blogs or on our website, of course you can go there. You can reach out to Ashwin and myself, also on LinkedIn, and happy to get a conversation going with you. So with that, Ashwin, I wanted to thank you for your time today. And I think this is a really, really important topic. And again, I said it's not going away. In fact, I think it's still going to get worse before it gets better. In fact, I'm not even sure how it's going to get better if we have less people being born. So this is going to be a real challenge for us over the next at least 5 to 10 years. So again, thank you for your time.